What is going on, everybody? Not the face you expected to see by himself anyway. It's your boy Jake Gucek here. Walt had some technical difficulties and we were a little bit behind, so sorry about that. Getting started a little bit late this evening, but we do still want to get you through both the two-game slate that we have on Friday night and then also the massive all-day 8-game conference championship slate. They're both conference championship slates, but the 8-game conference championship slate on Saturday. So want to get right into it. The 2-game slates, they're always going to be pretty straightforward with the must-have type plays, and you generally don't want to get too cute in main type lineup. There's always a case to be made for getting a little bit off the wall in GPP, but we'll kind of go over the format for both of those games. So it's the earlier game is North Texas and UT San Antonio. Obviously, we've been on that the UT San Antonio offense all year. They're explosive. They did lose one of their three core receivers that's going to be out for that and so we are limited to just Franklin and Cephas, so one less UTSA choice to get into. By the way, game total is 69.5, 8.5 point spread. Very competitive, very explosive, offensive-driven game, kind of stuff we like to see for DFS purposes. And then Utah USC not far behind, 67 total, and a 2.5 point spread, even more competitive game potentially. So we're really kind of neck and neck with those two in terms of and you like to see that on a 2-gamer, so you don't just have everybody stacking up the one game. But we'll start with that UTSA North Texas game. Best play on the board by far is UTSA's quarterback, Frank Harris. He is a dual threat. The guy just goes bonkers from time to time in the running game. Had 7 carries for 124 yards a couple weeks ago. That was his only game of the season over 100 yards rushing, but he does get in the end zone quite a bit on the ground. We do like to see that. And got 3 touchdowns on 7 carries in that same game, but also has put up 8 rushing touchdowns on the season and is no slouch throwing the ball as well. Sometimes we see with the rushing quarterbacks, they're not always as proficient running the offense as a typical drop back passer, and that is absolutely not the case with Frank Harris. He's got a very condensed passing game. At this point, it's pretty much just Zachary Franklin and Josh Cephas. Franklin is more of the alpha, and especially of late has commanded a pretty massive target share. Cephas is more of an explosive a boomer bust type receiver. It's hard to say that about a guy who's had, multiple double-digit catch games, because he does get the volume too. But his most recent game against UTEP, for example, 1 catch for 65 yards and a touchdown. Yeah, he got to 13.5 fantasy points, which is okay. But it doesn't, doesn't make your day. Doesn't break you, but if that pass gets dropped somehow, he could end up with 2 catches for 13 yards, which is what he did the previous week. So Franklin probably the safer option and probably about the same ceiling, to be honest with you. So if choosing between the two, I would probably lean Franklin, although there is a case to be made, this being the championship game, to try to get both in there. A lot of talent on that offense, and they're going to be down a few running backs as well. So probably pretty big focus on the passing game. On the North Texas side, well, I guess we can talk briefly about that UTSA running game. Kavorian Barnes is going to be the starting running back. We have seen him go off a couple times against Louisiana Tech and UAB. Getting passing game work, getting rushing game work, getting in the end zone. And then we see him completely disappear as well. And that's not entirely a function of carries being given to other running backs so much as it is Frank Harris punching it in down when they get close to the goal line, and also just the passing game being as robust as it is. So he is only 4,400 on DraftKings, definitely in consideration at that price. If you wanted to rock a trio of Harris, Barnes, and Franklin, or Harris, Barnes, and Cephas, and get exposure to all aspects of that offense, I certainly wouldn't knock it. It's an approach that would be quite viable on the slate. And then on the other side, probably a little bit more of a tendency for North Texas to want to run the ball a little bit, just to try to keep that explosive UTSA offense off the field. Austin Downey he's not the most explosive quarterback, but he is a little bit more than your average game manager. Price point at 5,100 doesn't do him justice for his level of talent. He is more talented than that. However, your other three options on the slate are Frank Harris, Cam Rising, and Caleb Williams, and all three of those are going to be more attractive from a ceiling perspective than Austin Downey is. And so in a main type lineup, I don't know that I would be getting there, not because I don't like that price point. I absolutely do. And in a different context, I might lean more towards using Downey as a value option. Don't need a ton of value on this slate, and you are going to need a ton of upside. So I think I am going to kind of lean towards using Harris as the quarterback on the slate, but you can certainly have Downey in consideration. UTSA's defense hasn't really stopped anyone all year, so that is viable in the running game. The backs have kind of rotated a bit for North Texas. The guy that was getting the bulk of the work towards the end of the season, especially in their last couple games against UAB and against Rice, is Ragsdale, Kika Ragsdale. We'll just call him Ragsdale. So he's far and away, probably the best running back on the slate. From a point per dollar perspective, he's only 3,500 on DraftKings and is going to be heavily used. So to get a guy at sub 4K in more or less about a bell cow role where he's getting 20 plus touches is a gift. And if he's less than 90% owned, I would be shocked. So you can kind of plug him in if you want to plug him in alongside Barnes, and you have a total of less than 8K devoted to both of your running back spots. You can do quite a bit, and so you're in good shape there from a price perspective, and can kind of work on whoever else you want to get involved. From the receiver side for North Texas, it really has been the Roderick Burns show pretty much all season. He hasn't been super explosive as of late. He was kind of getting more targets and was more consistent earlier in the season. He did have his best game of the season against UTSA, six catches for 139 yards. He hasn't gotten in the end zone much this season, only one touchdown all season. So that is something to be cognizant of if you are thinking about, going back to the well. Roderick Burns was very successful against them early in the season. However, that lack of production in the red zone, where they do tend to hit it off and needing to score from a super explosive play, maybe you want to lean a different direction on that. So at 5,600, he is a fair play. I wouldn't say he's absolutely a smash or anything like that. Might try to find a way to get all the way up to Cephas just to have that full UTSA stack going. And not a ton of other guys that I'm interested in the North Texas passing game. Jair Shorter has flashed recently. Other than that, there's just not a ton to like. We we want to see Jamori Macklin start to get going, but we haven't really seen it. And it's too thin for us to really trust anybody but Burns in that game. And even that, we're kind of counting on a lot of volume to happen in addition to, him being efficient, but not necessarily have the ability to get in the end zone. On to the USC Utah game. As mentioned, 67 total, 2.5 spread, very competitive game. USC looking to avenge the only loss that they have this season against this Utah team. So this for the Pac-12 championship and for USC's purposes, a berth almost certainly in the CFP if they can manage to win this game. How much they win this game by might determine their ranking in the CFP, but that's a whole nother story. I'm pretty sure Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams are focused on just winning this game and getting into that CFP and possibly putting the finishing touches on what is a little bit of a surprising Heisman campaign for Caleb Williams. So we'll start there with Caleb Williams. You are playing Caleb Williams. He's less than 9K. He's the best quarterback in all of college football. He's remarkably consistent. He runs the ball. He runs the ball into the end zone. He's a dynamic passer. He's the best playmaker that exists on this or on any slate. I don't have any counter argument. Usually, you can make a case for playing anybody over anybody, and you just can't here. You're playing Caleb Williams on a 2-game slate that Caleb Williams is on. That's all there is to it. Is it possible that USC decides to run the ball and smash Austin Jones, down Utah's throats because they're going to be in soft coverage against Caleb Williams, or they're going to be diverting so many linebackers to spying Caleb Williams that they're going to be soft on running back play? Yeah, it's possible. Caleb Williams is just so good though that it would be a fool's errand to go any other direction than that. So you're going to play him, which means you're probably not going to play Cam Rising. And Cam Rising, once again, had his best game of the season against USC. Let's go back to what Cam Rising did in that game. 415 yards passing with two passing touchdowns in addition to 11 carries for 60 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Cam Rising went absolutely bonkers in this game. Almost twice as many fantasy points in this game as his next highest total all season. So if you think that you are getting a repeat performance out of Cam Rising, you can absolutely try to pair up, say forget it to Frank Harris, and you can try to pair up Cam Rising and Caleb Williams. It's going to cost you a pretty penny. Cam Rising at 8K, not a place that I'm looking to allocate a ton of salary. I do think he'll have a good game. I don't see him having a better game than Caleb Williams, and I don't see him having such a more efficient game than Frank Harris that the 2K in savings you're going to get from Harris isn't going to be the more beneficial thing to do from that perspective. In the running game, Utah has been a challenge to figure out all season. It gets slightly less challenging on this slate because we don't have Tavian Thomas to worry about. He is no longer playing in this game. He is no longer a college athlete. He is going to the NFL. So that means that it is Jalen Glover potentially, or that means that it is Jonathan Johnson potentially, or that means that it is Micah Bernard potentially. And really, this has kind of traditionally been a spot that whoever we think the guy is, it ends up not really being that guy, or it is that guy and he just has kind of a so-so game. If it's not Tavian Thomas, it's kind of not worth using. Micah Bernard is probably, if I had to use a Utah running back, Micah Bernard is probably who I end up going with. The reality is you have to roster 2 running backs and only 2 running backs, and there are 2 running backs that are sub 5K that are the guy for their team, and those are the guys that I'm probably interested in using. Austin Jones on the USC side is fine at 6K. He did get 20 plus carries each of the last 2 weeks with no Travis Dye in the mix. He does have some involvement in the passing game. At that price point, I'm having a tough time getting there with similar volume coming from backs that you get a significant discount. 1,600 discount to Barnes and a 2,500 discount to Ragsdale. They're not there's not so much more talent to Austin Jones, or talent or opportunity to Austin Jones, that you need to force that in. Receiver wise, I am probably the world's biggest Jordan Addison fan. He did have kind of a ho-hum game against Notre Dame. He was kind of coming up slowly and probably a little bit more injured than they were letting on. But we're talking about the Pac-12 championship and a chance to put an exclamation point on the season for CFB consideration and the NFL draft and Caleb Williams' Heisman campaign. I think we see Jordan Addison show out in this one. Utah's defense not particularly able to stop Jordan Addison. The last time these two met, 706 and a touchdown, and that was before leaving in the third quarter with an injury. So we are going to play Jordan Addison with Caleb Williams, and so that means that we are probably going to shy away from Taj Washington a little bit. We are probably going to not have a ton of interest in Mario Williams. It's probably going to be targets focused on Jordan Addison. On the USC running back side, Raleek Brown is the only other viable option. I don't think we're getting into Darwin Barlow territory. It's more of like if we have a blowout, we see Darwin Barlow salt away the fourth quarter. Raleek Brown is the kick returner and gets involved in the passing game to a certain degree, and they give him a few carries here and there, but that's really more of a deep MME type play because he's not the 3K number he has been in the past. He's 5,100 now. So I think we're sticking to just Caleb Williams and Jordan Addison on the USC side, and then pass catchers from Utah. It's pretty simple. Kincaid is the man. I'm laughing again because it's like everybody had their best game against USC. 16 catches for 234 yards and a touchdown. Which is a good season for most tight ends, but Dalton Kincaid did that against USC in week 7. He also is fresh off, 11 catches for 99 against Oregon and 5,102 against Colorado. Dalton Kincaid at 6,600 is definitely in play and probably someone that you should be prioritizing as a run back in the Utah USC game for your Caleb Williams and Jordan Addison lineups. So that is pretty much the 2-gamer in a nutshell. We're going to go a core of Caleb Williams, Ragsdale, and Jordan Addison as well as Zachariah Franklin and Dalton Kincaid. Like I'm going to give you a 5-man core that includes 3 receivers. So we've talked a lot about, 4 running back slates. Is it a 2 QB or a 4 running back slate? This I think is a 4 wide receiver slate. The running back options are not sexy beyond the 2 extremely cheap running back options. And I think we have a lot more upside in using the flex spot for a 4th receiver as opposed to a 3rd running back that is a kind of meh or doesn't necessarily have all the possible opportunity. So that's that slate. Moving on, we will also be taking a look at a quick rundown of the longer Saturday slate. So that one is how many games? That's a 7-8 gamer. We'll go through that and kick that off. Let's see, pulling up the slate there. Hang on just a second. So we'll kick that off, go quickly game by game. K-State and TCU. we have a pretty, all these games are going to be pretty competitive. Obviously, championship games are just by their nature two pretty good teams. K-State and TCU, 62 total, 2.5 spread. Do want to see that. And at AT&T, so we're not going to have any weather in that one, in the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. Not a ton of interest in Max Duggan at 8,100. Obviously, he's had a phenomenal season, especially within the context of him being Max Duggan. Certainly exceeded my expectations, but this is a pretty massive price to pay for a guy that kind of historically has wilted in big moments. And he's had big games. He's only really had one game all season where you absolutely needed to have him, and that was against OU. And Oklahoma has been giving up those kind of games to just about everyone. And though that game in particular was a game where he went for 116 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He has 5 rushing touchdowns on the season. 2 of the 5 came in that game. And he has rushed for 100 yards or more that game only. So the rushing upside that you see on the season from Duggan is heavily skewed by that game in particular. K-State isn't the world's world's best defense, but they are worlds better than Oklahoma. So for that reason, probably staying away. On the other side, Will Howard is actually pretty intriguing. He's taken over the job from Adrian Martinez and has looked great in limited opportunity towards the end of the season here. Doesn't have the same kind of upside. We were getting into a little bit of a spat on the rushing upside of Will Howard because his rushing PrizePicks number was like 3.5. And so there was some chatter about that being a pretty easy over, which I believe in, as long as the offensive line can protect him and we don't get the negative sack yardage conflating all of that. So hang on, little technical difficulty real quick. So we're back. And so I think he's probably in your GPP pool, but not necessarily somebody that I would focus on for a main lineup. And then at the running back position, Deuce Vaughn is Deuce Vaughn. He's fantastic. He is as steady as they go in terms of putting up 30 plus points, or at least close to it in most games that remain competitive. I'm probably going to be using a significant amount of Deuce Vaughn. That is very much a main lineup type play, whereas the quarterbacks I'm not as confident in using for a main lineup. And then on the TCU side, been on Kendre Miller all season. They have refused to raise his price all season. You can count on, probably 15 total touches and a touchdown of some sort. There is not a game this season that Kendre Miller has played in where he hasn't scored a touchdown. That's ridiculous. And that's just rushing touchdowns. So 16 touchdowns on the season. That's just a ridiculous amount of consistency. So 200 carries, over 1,200 yards on the season with 16 touchdowns. They feed him the rock. And with all of the focus on the passing game, I do see him being able to break loose a time or two. And at that price point, 6,600, is right there with some other guys that'll be very popular. And so we once again will probably get a lower owned Kendre Miller, which we've been doing all season, and he has not let us down once. He's scored every single week, right? You can't let us down when you get in the end zone. So especially at that price point. So I'm very, very interested in him as well for kind of a main lineup. Probably won't end up doing a lot of him and Deuce together, just because when running backs are successful, they tend to chew up a lot of clock and don't leave a lot of time for the other running back to have the ball a whole lot. Flip side of that, if you're game stacking this for GPP and you're hoping for like a 55 to 47 type of ending, they probably both get in the end zone multiple times. So either do it all the way and get everybody in this game, or kind of leave it to one or the other of Deuce or Kendra Miller. So then on to the receivers. K-State, the only one that I have any interest at all is Malik Knowles. TCU, if we get word that Quentin Johnston is a full go, and he's been kind of like halfway a full go all season. And so he's really only had the two explosive games against Kansas and against Oklahoma State, where he was like a must-have kind of guy, and then every other game has been kind of meh. He's probably a GPP target for me. Whereas with Malik Knowles, I really do like his usage. He's been involved, not just catching the ball, but they've also kind of been creating plays, especially down in the goal line. 2 rushing touchdowns against Kansas a week ago, and even though he wasn't super involved in the passing game, they still found a way to get him to nearly 20 DraftKings points. So at 5,400, I do have a lot of interest in Malik Knowles. Moving on to the next game, MAC championship. For those of us who are grizzled veterans of the MAC, we know that crazy things happen, and that does not change in the championship game. So we do know who at least one of the quarterbacks will be. So CJ Harris, who we wrote off in, after a limited performance against Ball State in week 12, had the world's best performance from a dual threat quarterback in week 13. Threw the ball okay, I guess, 10 completions for 196 yards and a touchdown, but rushed for 12 attempts, 65 rushing yards, and 3 touchdowns. So if you think lightning strikes twice against a much better Toledo defense, he's 5,500. And Toledo may not be ready for a running quarterback, despite having the best running quarterback in the conference in Daquan Finn. You can play that narrative. I don't necessarily know that I'm going to go to a lot of CJ Harris, just because the book is out now. We know what we're going to get from him. And so does Toledo, and they can prepare for that in a way that maybe after not having seen a whole lot of him, Bowling Green was not really prepared for. Even though there's a scouting report, it's one thing to plan for, it's another to actually see it. Toledo practices against Finn, who is the best quarterback in the MAC when he's healthy. So, and he's definitely a dual threat. So, moving on to Finn, we may get Finn, we may get Tucker Gleason. We will not know until probably Saturday morning at some point as to who is going to be starting that one. Tucker Gleason is fine. If we aren't getting Finn, if we definitively aren't getting Finn, Tucker Gleason also destroyed Bowling Green in his one full game of play, throwing for 329 and 3, and then additionally rushing for 106 and 2. If anybody were playing Bowling Green on this slate, I would tell you to use the quarterback playing Bowling Green. No one's playing Bowling Green. That said, I would probably side with whoever the Toledo quarterback is here, between Finn if he's fully healthy, or Gleason if Finn is going to be ruled out of this one, just because the Ohio defense isn't quite as stout as the Toledo defense. And to just give you some additional context there, this is a lower total. It is 54.5. And Toledo is a 3-point favorite. Should Finn be ruled into this one, they would probably jump to closer to a 5.5 or a 6-point favorite, I would guess. Also, this game also indoors, so no weather concerns in that one, which is, it can be a factor at this point of the season. On to running back for that game. Bangura is really the only piece that we're interested in. He does get a massive amount of carries, 20 plus each of the last 3 and really 4 of the last 5. He's gotten 20 plus carries. He did miss a game 2 to injury back in week 9 or 10, somewhere in there, but he came back with a vengeance and closed the season on a high note. Does sometimes see a little bit of passing work as well. 7,100 is a little bit pricey, but for that amount of volume, I can certainly justify using him on the slate. Wide receiver wise, going to be kind of interesting because we don't necessarily know that we can trust what we're going to see out of CJ Harris. Don't know that I want to put all of my eggs in the Ohio receiver basket. Sam Wilglis, the Ohio State transfer, has kind of been their alpha all season. And in the Bowling Green game where we saw CJ Cross, he only got the 1 catch for 20 yards. He did score on it, but he was not the guy that kind of dominated that game. And so that was it's really been more Jacoby Jones as of late. Miles Cross had a ridiculous game against Miami of Ohio back in week 11 and then barely showed up in each of the subsequent games. So it's a little bit of an unpredictable passing game anyway. And then if you add to that the fact that there's a predominantly rushing quarterback going up against one of the better defenses that he will have gone up against, I just don't want to put a whole lot of salary into those receivers. On the other side, regardless of we get Finn or Gleason, Devin Maddox is viable. Jawan Newton is viable. Demir Blankhamsey, despite not doing a ton lately, is probably viable. And then if you really want to go digging for value, Jamal Turner down at 4,200 is also viable. None of these guys are target hogs where you will see, massive Xavier Hutchinson 12 catch, 120 yard type games. You're really hoping for something like 6 catches for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns, just because one of them happens to break a couple long ones and end up in the end zone. So it is very much a mix and match Mac situation with the Toledo wide receivers. So we'll move on to then Coastal Carolina and Troy. Obviously, Coastal Carolina looks quite a bit different without Grayson McCall at quarterback. So we are probably not going to see him. He hasn't been officially ruled out, but kind of just not trending in that direction, especially given that Troy is an 8.5-point favorite. If Grayson McCall were fully healthy, I would see Coastal Carolina as probably being favored a little bit in that game, and certainly not 8.5-point dogs. So tea leaves are pointing to no Grayson McCall, which would mean we're going to get potentially Jarrett Guest, who we saw against James Madison, and Jarrett Guest was not very good. Bryce Carpenter, we also saw against James Madison, and Bryce Carpenter hasn't done much either. Reality is probably not a whole lot of interest in anything from the Coastal Carolina side. They just have looked kind of lost and punchless without Grayson McCall as their leader. We had high hopes for Reese White going into the season. He was initially supplanted by CJ Beasley, who also hasn't done much lately. Nothing from Braden Bennett this year. It's kind of a mess there. And then Pinckney and Brown are kind of the 2 wide receivers that have flashed this season at times. Again, both really with Grayson McCall, and not as much with the backup quarterbacks. So that really leaves kind of just the Troy side of things, and Troy's entire offense, if you have taken a look at any box scores lately, is just Kamani Vidal. 21 carries. Well, so starting in week 6, 17 carries, 11 carries, 17 carries, 21 carries, 13 carries. And that was against Army. So Service Academy game kind of puts a damper on most offenses. And then back up to 29 carries and 33 carries in the final against Arkansas State, their final game of the season. Over 200 yards each of the last 2 games, 6 total touchdowns in those last 2 games, just coming into this on an absolutely high note at 5,700 is one of the better plays on the slate at running back, even though we're in a low total. And I certainly hope that the industry trends towards ignoring this game completely, because a high usage bell cow running back in a team that's favored by 8.5 with a low total, meaning the opposing offense probably won't do a lot and he'll get a ton of opportunity, is like the absolute nut spot. And he's sub 6K. So a lot of interest in Kamani Vidal. So we'll move right on to LSU Georgia. We can skip the LSU side. I'm not going to recommend players against the Georgia defense on an 8-game slate. It's just it's not something we want to be in the business of doing. Yes, Jaden Daniels has had like this ridiculous season, resurrected his career, resurrected LSU's hopes, both in the SEC and getting them into this championship game, and also, as a program in general. But against Georgia's made everyone look terrible. So not going to do anything there. Stetson Bennett, fine. He's Stetson Bennett. He'll probably throw for a couple 100 yards and throw a couple touchdowns to guys that you've never heard of. And that'll be it for Stetson Bennett. And then they turn it over to the run game for most of the time. We do potentially have some interest in McIntosh, who has just been lights out the last 2 weeks at 6,500. Kendall Milton has kind of taken a back seat. And then the guy who had started to flash for a few games earlier in the season, especially against Florida, Dwan Edwards, hasn't done much lately either. So it's been the McIntosh show at 6,500. There's just a lot of other backs in that territory that aren't splitting carries 4 ways. And so I probably won't go McIntosh in Maine, but he is certainly viable for MME or even kind of like a 20 max type of GPP, getting some exposure there. But I would probably prefer like a Will Shipley or a Donovan Edwards at that same price point, if we're being completely honest. The only other piece to talk about from that game, in the passing game, you can talk about a lot of receivers at Georgia, and really it's kind of a coin flip between Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers. One of them will do well, one of them will do nothing. I probably would side with Brock Bowers in this one, just because he tends to show up in big games and in big spots, and this is the biggest spot that they've had all season. We do get Adonai Mitchell back at 4,800. I don't know that we're going to see him for a ton of plays. It's kind of going to be like a Pickens situation from last year, where they use him for a couple deep balls and maybe he catches them, maybe he doesn't. Rosemy Jackson, fantastic name. Not a lot of volume. Probably are going to have trouble going there, and then you're getting into weirdness with Darnell Washington and guys that catch like 1 or 2 balls a game. Just not a lot of interest in the Georgia passing game, other than the Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey coin flip. So moving on to the next, Fresno State against Boise State. That one does have some interesting plays, and it's a 54.5 total. I'm probably going to have the most interest in this game in Taylon Green. Just massive performance against Utah State on the heels of two very good performances against Nevada and Wyoming. Fresno State is obviously much tougher competition, but the fact that Taylon Green is not just running the ball anymore and is being an efficient passer and building up the confidence to be a legitimate dual threat, have a lot of interest in Taylon Green in this one, and at only 6,300, we're looking in like we're in pretty good shape. 6,600, you're looking like we're in pretty good shape using him. Probably going to have some exposure to Holani as well. Taylon Green did steal a lot of the touchdowns, throwing some short passes for touchdowns, rushing a touchdown in on his own. So Holani had a down game in what was probably a pretty good spot against Utah State. But he's also put up massive games in his own right. Colorado State in particular, 21 for 108 and 3 touchdowns. And then against the Fresno State earlier in the season, 17, 157 on the ground, and then got a touchdown receiving in that one. So either Holani or Green will have a pretty big game in this one. And so you probably don't want to play them together, but you do want exposure to both if you're running different lineups. The receivers on the sticking with the Boise State side, it's going to be a challenge to find a receiver that we really like. This is a decent secondary for Fresno State. Latrell Caples was the man against Utah State. We've also seen Billy Bones flash at times. Stephon Cobbs, who was supposed to be the man starting the season, he's going to be out. And then Eric McAllister had 2 touchdowns in the most recent game against Utah State. So going to be some mix and match in the Boise State passing game, but Taylon Green is not necessarily a guy you have to stack up receivers with because of that dual threat aspect. So probably going to focus mainly on Taylon Green and or Holani from this game. And then, if we need to mix and match some receivers, if you feel the need to pair up those options, you can certainly do that. Not a ton of interest at Jake Haener at somewhat of an elevated price point. I do have interest in Mims, who, we've seen him be dominant all season. No fewer than 15 carries with the exception of the San Diego State game. Bunch of touchdowns, 15 touchdowns on the season, 14 of those of the rushing variety, but does see some involvement in the passing game. At 6,900, a little bit of an elevated price point for facing a decent defense, but we definitely have interest in Mims. Also should mention that this is essentially a home game for Boise. So there's a little bit of a narrative to maybe trend towards using the Boise players, but Mims also is very interesting. Don't know that I want a lot of Cropper or Remigio. Similarly to Haener, these guys are kind of priced a little bit out of my level of interest. If they were lower priced, I probably would have a little bit more interest, but for the limit to their ceiling, these prices are just too much. Seven for Moreno Cropper is too much. I mean, 7 is what you pay for him when he's, going to have all kinds of volume and of explosiveness, not when he's going to be facing what's a top 25 secondary. So probably limited to just Mims on the Fresno State side, and then Green and Holani on the Boise State side. So then the other 4 o'clock Eastern kick, UCF and Tulane. We love Tyjae Spears from Tulane. The guy just continues to put up big game after big game. we were a little bit hesitant to use him against Cincinnati because Cincinnati has historically been a pretty decent defense. He got the most volume that he's seen all season, 35 carries for 181 and 2 touchdowns. And you can add in another 17 yards receiving, just massive work for Spears. And now gets to face a much softer defense in UCF. And this one in Louisiana does kind of favor Tulane in terms of being, relatively speaking, a home game. So I think that Tulane will have no problem doing whatever they want to do on offense, and it appears they want to give Spears as much volume as possible. So along with Waddell, I'm extremely interested in Spears at the running back position. So those are he's kind of the main guy I'm interested in on the Tulane side. Pratt is also interesting, and he had that massive game against SMU where he ran it in a bunch, and that was like the one time that Spears didn't flash with as many rushing touchdowns, but only because it was Pratt that took him. Pratt's an interesting play too. $7K. He's a little bit pricier than I would want to go, especially with Taylor Green sitting there at 66 and the guys from Toledo at either 67 or 6. So I do want to see if I can find my way to Pratt to play him. He's just at a slightly more elevated price point than I would like. And then the receivers for Tulane are where it gets a little bit tough. We've seen a big Shea Wyatt game against SMU. We know that Deuce Watts has done a lot historically, but hasn't had games where he's really flashed a whole lot this year. And then Tyreek James every now and then will have like a massive game out of nowhere. So that's very much also a mix and match spot. Not going to lock any of those Tulane receivers. On the other side, we've been playing the Plumlee or Mikey Keene game all season with UCF, and we're going to probably have that same thing happen again. The news thus far is that Plumlee is practicing and he's ready to go, and he's not 100%, but he is going to play. Of course, that's what we saw last week, and we need Plumlee to be pretty close to 100% to be the effective quarterback that he's capable of being, because what we really need him to do is run the ball, and he did that in spades against USF. He got 8 carries for 133 yards and 2 touchdowns, and also, extremely efficient throwing the ball, 9 of 9 for 73 yards and a touchdown before he got hurt and couldn't finish that one out. So, do we get Plumlee 100%? If we do, and we think he's going to play the whole game, Plumlee is the best play on the slate. If we think he's injured and maybe not going to be entirely himself or could get pulled halfway through, it becomes a complete nightmare, right? So we will want to pay a lot of attention to news and reporting, but ultimately you're still going to have a pretty tough decision on Plumlee in terms of trusting that he's going to be 100% in that one. And then running backs for UCF, Bowser is kind of the starter in name only, and gets the grunt work between the tackle stuff. RJ Harvey is really the guy. At 5,400, RJ Harvey can certainly be in consideration. There's just guys that are, again, at a slightly more elevated price point, but a much more certain workload that I would prefer. And I've certainly been in on the revelation that is RJ Harvey this season, and he's put up the production for the most part, but especially if we have a fully healthy John Rice Plumlee that could dominate the rushing touchdown work, going to probably save Harvey for GPP only territory. Receiver wise, it is, UCF receiver roulette. Typically O'Keefe is the guy that's going to have the floor. Baker is the guy that's going to have the ceiling, and Hudson is the guy who is for some reason priced similarly, but doesn't ever really do a whole lot except for the 2 games that he splashed against Temple and against Memphis. So definitely mix and match those guys as you see fit. And I know I've said that a lot with receivers, but that is really kind of how this slate boils down, is there's not a massive alpha other than the guy in the game we're about to talk about, which is Clemson versus UNC. And our boy Josh Downs, Jordan Addison East, or Jordan Addison could be Josh Downs West. They're excuse me, 2 extremely talented receivers that are going to be very high NFL draft picks, and get a ton of volume in their respective offenses and have the absolute respect of their respective quarterbacks. So we are going to talk about UNC first. Drake May and Josh Downs. If you can get both of them in your lineup somehow and still have any money left over to do anything, Drake May at 8,500 and Josh Downs at 7,600 are extremely expensive, but rightfully so. I'm not scared of this Clemson defense at all. And if you can save enough in other spots to get to that pairing, I absolutely love that pairing. The total in that one is 63.5. North Carolina, 7.5 point dogs. Game is being played in Charlotte. So, I mean, Clemson versus North Carolina, probably going to have a pretty split fan base of that one. But, man, this is just an absolutely amazing spot for Drake May. He's going to have to pass. He's going to mainly target Josh Downs. Clemson does not really have the personnel to shut down a receiver like Josh Downs. And even though NC State was able to kind of limit Downs and Georgia Tech made it a weird game in the week before that, the games before those 2, Virginia, where Downs put up 15, 166 and 1, or Wake, where Downs put up 11, 154 and 3, are a lot more the type of game that I would expect from Downs in what is, his audition for the NFL. I don't think we're going to get a bowl game from him. I think we're going to get this ACC championship, and he's going to put his exclamation point on the season, and then we're going to see him as a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. So on to, let's see, on to the Clemson side. Will Shipley. It's really all I can offer you is Will Shipley. If you want to mix in some Antonio Williams and some run backs, I kind of get that. There's some explosiveness there. He did have an amazing game, against Louisville earlier in the season. But at the end of the day, this Clemson offense just hasn't really done anything consistently in the passing game, and Will Shipley has kind of been a big part of that passing game too. So I think my interest in that one lies really on Shipley. And then in the other late game, the other 8 Eastern start, Purdue against Michigan, at Indianapolis. It's tough to want to take anyone on the Purdue side. Aiden O'Connell in a game against like a Michigan State type defense, yeah, you can play an Aiden O'Connell, and obviously he had some spike games against Nebraska and Syracuse earlier in the year, but this is Michigan. You don't play quarterbacks against Michigan. You just don't do it. Their defense is too good. Your offense is too bad. It's going to be a nightmare. So yes, he's going to be throwing a lot. They're chasing 3 scores, 17-point spread, 52-point total. But I can't play Aiden O'Connell in this slate, which means I probably am also not going to be paying $7,400 for Charlie Jones, especially if I'm paying $7,600 for Josh Downs. Running backs, if you want to try to get cute and use Maccabee, gets a ton of volume. He got a ton of volume against Indiana. 15 carries for 99 yards and also 5 catches in the passing game, had a touchdown on the ground. He's not going to be quite that efficient against Michigan. I think he'll still have like a 18 carry and 70-yard game. Maybe he scores, maybe he doesn't. But again, at 6,100, there's just so many more explosive plays to use in this game, including and especially the guy on the other side of it at 6,400, Donovan Edwards. And it's really tough between Spears, Waddell, and Edwards to pick a favorite running back. Those three are my absolute, hey, your core. Typically, we give a core of a quarterback, a running back, and a wide receiver. My core on this slate is going to be 3 running backs. It's going to be Spears, Waddell, and Edwards. With Corum out, the amount of volume that Edwards is going to get against a very beatable defense in the most meaningful Michigan game in God knows how many years, Edwards is going to absolutely crush in this game. And at only 6,400, he should be with Corum out. And obviously they didn't know for sure that Corum was going to be out when pricing came out. So, with Corum out, Edwards should be an $8,500 running back, and we're getting him at 64. So Spears, Waddell, and Edwards use all 3 of those. To wrap up, I will give you also a traditional core, which is going to be, let's go Taylon Green at quarterback, Kimani Vidal at running back, and Josh Downs at wide receiver. But with the corollary that, I'm also very high on Spears and Edwards. And if you can get all 3 of those into your lineup and still get a few other guys, and you don't have to pay a ton for them. None of those guys are over 7K. And Vidal's down 5,700. So, very affordable running backs to get the other pieces that you want on this slate. And we haven't talked about a ton of value at the receiver position. And man, I wish Walt was here for that, because that's kind of the thing that he specializes in. So I will, I guess, go down to the guy who just absolutely crushed last week, also from Michigan, Cornelius Johnson, got open behind the defense by like 30 yards against Ohio State a couple times. And if they run those same plays, then Purdue's going to get smashed by Cornelius Johnson. He's up to 5,100, which is a little bit more than I would want to pay. He was down at 43 last week and had been in the 3s most of the season prior to that. So not as much of a value, but that is a target to potentially use. And then the other one we mentioned on the Boise State, Eric McAllister, that caught 2 touchdowns, especially if you're using Taylon Green. Interesting one to use there. And then you're just getting into a lot of very GPP type plays. So that's probably it for me. We do try to get into PrizePicks a little bit, and I know that there's going to be discussion about that in the Discord. I'll try to pull that up right now, and we'll get you a couple plays on PrizePicks. Hang on, give me just a second here. This one we talked about in the Discord already. Maccabee, I mentioned that we are not bullish on him at his DraftKings price point, but at 55.5 rushing yards, I think he gets to 60 pretty easily. And so at 55.5, that's a pretty easy over. Taylon Green, I also like his fantasy score of 20.5. I like that as an over. Antonio Williams from Clemson, they have his fantasy score at 8.5. That's like 3 catches for 55 yards or 4 catches for 45 yards. Very doable number there for a team that is very thin at receiver and could see some volume from him. And then this is from the Friday slate, but Frank Harris at 25.5 fantasy points. I think he gets well above 30 in what should be a pretty back and forth game that his offense can kind of do whatever it wants. So that is going to be it for me. We will go crush this weekend, and we'll make all the money, and we will see you again soon.